Hi, I'm Jane Dunnewold, and I appreciate your taking a few minutes to go through my exhibition inspired by the Masters, which is here at the Visions Museum in San Diego, in a beautiful renovated complex that used to be a military base. Still an airport very nearby, so I apologize in advance for the planes you're probably going to hear flying overhead as we visit a little bit about the work that I prepared for this exhibition. The original impulse for the exhibition came from visiting a show of Matisse paintings, and mainly still life paintings, that traveled the country, and I was fortunate enough to see it with my husband in San Antonio, Texas, which is where we live. I came away totally jazzed by his fabulous use of color and by the spontaneity of the marks, even though it was obvious in the exhibition that he was meticulous at going over and over a particular kind of a mark or a particular kind of a brush stroke until he got what he wanted. In any event, I came away wishing that I could abandon my rather quiet palette and wanting to explore color because it looked like he was having such a great time, to tell you the truth. So, as things always do, what happened was that I was in a thrift store, and in the thrift store there were a couple of pieces of what I consider vintage needlework. And needlework can be embroidery or needlepoint, which is on a canvas surface, for those of you who aren't familiar with various needlework processes. I found these two pieces that were probably done in the late 70s, and having learned to embroider in the late 70s myself, there was an immediate resonance. And so those pieces of appropriated needlework done by some other unknown artist, embroiderer, became the foundation for the pieces that are all around me now. In order to walk through the process a little, I would like to share with you Grandmother's Flower Garden. This was inspired by pieces of the Grandmother's Flower Garden quilt. These two blocks were blocks that I just found, not part of the quilt yet. Then you can see the embroideries that I'm referring to, these beautiful wool crewel, C-R-E-W-E-L pieces that some other artist made. I didn't have a process yet. I had to develop the process, and in a nutshell, I decided I would use a silk noil, which is a textured silk, as the background because it was heavy enough to support the needlework pieces that I was planning to add. Playing overhead. I decided that I would use my soy crayons to draw the flora and fauna onto the silk background. They are dye crayons, so that meant that they needed to be steamed, and when I took them out of the steamer, I'd have these vibrant colors that I could build into with the needlepoint and the additional work that I was planning to add. I used silk screens of designs that I drew of plants and flower shapes to screen print the original outline of some of the imagery, and then as my process evolved, I decided to take wool roving, which is the loose wool before it has been woven, and also wool and silk embroidery floss. And these became not only the outline of some of the plant forms in the piece, but also sometimes the shadowing or the actual color and texture within the leaf shapes. And so that's sort of how the materials came together. In addition to the appropriated needlework and in addition to the soy crayons, I did use some dye painting. I did use my textile paints on occasion. And in order to put all these parts together and turn them into a seamless whole, I used Misty Fuse, which is a fusible web, and Misty Fuse is actually one of the sponsors of this exhibition. So I would put this fusible web on the back of the pieces and steam it to stick all the parts together. And then when I had all the parts stuck onto the silk background, I used a machine called an embellisher. And an embellisher has 7 needles, no thread. The needles are barbed. And the machine forces the needles up and down through all of the layers of the composition in this case, and it literally shreds the fabric and binds it all together. That may not mean anything to you if this is all new, so if we take just a quick look at the back of this piece, you can see the shadow outlines of some of the shapes on the front. And that's actually the fiber that's been pushed to the back in the process of using that machine to attach the various parts. Sometimes I added hand embroidery. Frequently, I used my quilting machine to quilt patterns into the surface that had already been created and to attach it even more securely to the backing fabric. And describing all of those parts is really only meant to give you some indication of how time-consuming all of this is on one hand, but also what the artist's mind is thinking and how the artist's mind works to evolve pieces so that they look like a seamless whole, but they're actually rather complex. Let's walk to this piece. This piece represents a little bit of a shift in my mindset. This was the third piece in the series. I had done 2 of the grandmother flower garden pieces, and I was really beginning to pick up steam, and I was spending a lot of time in thrift stores looking for needlework, and then I discovered eBay, one of my new best friends, because I could find pieces of vintage needlework on eBay at most of the time pretty decent prices. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, in the 70s, late 70s, there was a huge resurgence of interest in hand embroidery. And sometimes it was with wool thread, and sometimes it was with cotton or silk thread. And it was quite popular at that time for companies to create kits, which were a particular kind of a design already stamped on the fabric, and then exactly the right number of threads and the right needle. You'd buy all of this as a kit, and that kit allowed you to create an image that might look like this, the flowers in this vase. So there were probably thousands of this kit available. There were thousands of this kit with the lamp and the knitting basket. And many of us learned embroidery by using these kits. And so what I find kind of ironic is that these are mass-produced, but created by one single person. And so how well they were considered to have been done had a lot to do with the skill of the person who did the embroidery. But I thought it was funny that as I started to look in a broader sort of circle for pieces to use in my compositions, sometimes I'd find 3 of exactly the same kit that had been done obviously by different women. So knitting with Matisse focuses on this little basket of yarn, and maybe you can see here that the background was the stitched background of the original composition. I cut this all out in order to merge it into my own surface, and then I made a silk screen so that I could, based on the little florets in this particular pattern, so that I could print them and incorporate them in order to make this a not completely seamless inclusion, but in order to incorporate it so that it made visual sense. I was also, and have still been, buying up a lot of doilies and dresser linens, and so sometimes I'd actually take the dresser linen and take advantage of the beautiful cut work that was done, but turn it into, in this case, the vase, and then use the quilting machine to create the patterning. Here's another piece that also, okay, plain overhead. Another piece, actually rather late in the series. The series evolved over about 2.5 years. This is one of the later pieces, and I was just thrilled when I found this tablecloth. I knew it had to be used this way. I hadn't done the same sort of a tablecloth effect since that really early piece that we just looked at, but I knew this particular tablecloth, if I could just get the angle right, it would work out. And it took some maneuvering and some stretching and some rearranging and some auditioning in order to figure out how the parts should fit, but I'm pleased with it in the end. I was also finding small vignettes, like the ones you see right here, and I was remembering from Matisse's paintings the number of times that he would literally put a small composition within the larger composition. And so finding these small embroidered vignettes gave me the opportunity to mimic that, that sort of visual device that I admired so much about Matisse's work. So in this particular piece, you see the beautiful embroidery in the vase. This is my own screen printed fabric. And then the fruits, which play an important role in this particular composition, were all drawn onto felt, and I used the wool roving, which is the unspun wool, to actually create the coloring and the shaping and the texture on the fruit. Let's move to another piece. This one is called Still Life with Cat, and Matisse frequently used animals in his own works. I was tickled by the number of cats that you find in needlepoints and embroideries. I resisted the impulse to use all the cats that I found, but I did use cats a couple of times, and I think they're charming. This is a needlepoint piece on the left, and one of the more significant things about this composition is the opportunity that I had to extend the flowers, which ended right here in the original needlepoint, up into the background. I drew them and then hand colored them, and then once again used the embroidery and the needle felting to carry the flowers out into the rest of the composition in a way that hopefully would blend the parts together. That was one of my challenges, was to take these separate elements, which might not seem to be related at all, lay them onto the background and sketch in the various parts of the composition, and then figure out how to incorporate them so that they blend, the parts blend together instead of looking like separate and sort of blocky entities. And I did that several ways. Sometimes I screen printed a design, which you might be able to see along the edge of this particular door. I carried that screen printing right back onto the needlepoint. Over here, on this side, the background behind the cat is a series of horizontal bands of needlepoint. I tried to match the color with my paint mixing abilities as well as I could, and then I used the quilting machine to create that same, or mimic that same sort of linear pattern on the wall. It's a challenge as an artist to be able to match the colors and then mimic the techniques, and I derived a lot of satisfaction from needing to get those parts to figure out accurately or appropriately. And then a friend brought me some embroidery. Word gets out, we all know how that goes, from a trip that she took to Mexico. And I'd already done a piece based on the colors and the garden of Frida Kahlo's garden in Mexico, a piece we'll see in a few minutes. But this piece also struck me as a piece that might be something that you'd see in Frida Kahlo's dining room. I didn't call it that, but you could see that the colors are a bit different from the other pieces that we've looked at so far. And one of the devices that I use that I haven't mentioned is that I literally began to print Matisse still life images from the internet onto clear acetate, or a transparency. And I did it in black and white. And then I would put that transparency on an overhead projector, and I would project the painting literally onto my fabric. And I used a washable marker to draw in some of the basic parts of the Matisse composition. And then I put that away, because these weren't intended to be knockoffs of Matisse in quite that way. It was an inspiration in my mind rather than trying to mimic so exactly what he did. But I did learn a lot about composition from looking at the angles and the parts and how they all fit together. And I used my own, of course, artistic license to decide what the colors should look like and what the combinations of especially when it came to the needlepoint and the embroidery that I was using, that was dictated more by what was arriving in the mail than it was by anything that was actually derived from a Matisse painting. So the entire tabletop here is a cut up textile from Mexico, as is the doily under the vase. But it was really fun to be able to explore different kinds of color combinations, as I say at the beginning, because of the wonderful use of color. I was able to go so many directions. This piece is a little bit of a different approach to using the needlework. This was, I believe they call it eagle lachkoi. It's a Russian punch needle technique of putting the threads into the fabric. And this piece, this scene with the boats, ends right here. That was the original eagle lachkoi piece. And my challenge was to use, again, my paints and my threads, my needle felting, to blend the picture so that it appeared to be larger than it was originally, even as far as carrying it out into the windows at the top. But I loved this. I actually have 3 of this little flower basket. I still have 2 I haven't used, but that was another one of those funny indications of the kits that were available. That one must have been pretty popular, and I'm sure it was, because if you can see, this has a lot of texture. That's a particular kind of a stitch that's really lots of fun to do, and it created a really terrific puffy surface, which is a little bit different, and it's in contrast to this beautiful pearl cotton cross stitch piece. We move over here. On my left is the last piece of the series as the series stands now. I still have baskets and baskets of embroidery and needlework, and I love them. Whether the series will continue is an open question. But this was the last piece that I had time to do before the pieces needed to be delivered to San Diego. And I decided that I would go back to the Grandmother Flower Garden pattern because I still had these beautiful blocks. You can see one of them here and one of them behind the birds. I'd also been acquiring, I think birds must have been a really popular topic with these early kits because I'd been hanging on to the parrot for a while. I loved it, but that's a fairly dramatic piece to incorporate. I had these birds, which are quite different in style, so I had a variety of different styles of birds, and I decided that I would challenge myself to use all of them on one piece. And so this is another version of Grandmother's Flower Garden, and the thing that really cinched it, to tell you the truth, was finding this amazing waterfall scene online and ordering it with great anticipation and knowing that once it got here, I'd be able to build the birds and the scenario around it. So it was great fun to do that, and you can see this has more of that stitching that is dimensional and delightful as far as I'm concerned. So, one of my personal favorites, I think, and not because it was the last. As I said, there is another piece that has a cat, and I couldn't resist this piece of needlepoint. The original piece, you can see, is actually outlined, and I did trim the floor so that it would work into my dyed and waxed floor, which is at the bottom here. But then I had some fun because I laid a piece of tracing paper over this pattern, and I copied the blocks and I turned it into a little silk screen, which is called a thermofax screen. And I made the screen so that I could print the wall and continue the wall with that same pattern. And I think that worked out pretty effectively. So, put in the background color here, added the printing of the wall, and then was stunned by these gorgeous flowers, which were actually on a huge table runner sent to me by my friend Cheryl Braswell. People began, this is the wonderful thing about the textile community, people begin to send you things, so you better be willing to accept them. The flowers were originally red stitching on a white background, so I hand colored them, but they were so dramatic, I knew they'd be beautiful, but I had to figure out an appropriate vase. And so this particular shape seemed to work pretty well with the flowers, and instead of trying to print it, I've actually used a piece of spoonflower fabric, which is a piece of fabric that I designed and had printed digital printing by spoonflower.com. That seemed to work out pretty well. Then I had some real fun on this side, because one of the most wonderful challenges, as I've already said in several of the pieces, was to take a small piece of embroidery, in this case that embroidery, and then match the color of the sky and paint it into the top portion of the composition, and then use tape to mask off the parts of this porch sort of decoration, or fence, I guess it really is. What do they call that? It's like a patio, right? Anyway, get the color so that it would match this as closely as I could, and then I used black stitching to outline the individual sort of balustrades or posts of that little porch. So that was fun, and I felt good about how that turned out. Now we come around to the very first piece in this entire series. This is what kicked the whole thing off. This was my first Grandmother's Flower Garden piece. We started this little recording with the second one in the series, and this is the piece that was inspired not only by the beautiful Grandmother Flower Garden blocks that I had, but also by this delightful needlepoint of the birds in the fountain. And you can see this really heavily relied on the soy wax crayons to do the drawing of the background, the flora and the fauna. Not so much reliance on the embroidery pieces, although this does remain one of my favorite pieces of needlepoint. And I loved being able to work it and build it into the background surface by adding these delightful wool embroidered flowers and leaves. Frida's Gate is the largest piece in the series, and also one of the most challenging pieces. There are always, as any body of work unfolds for any artist, sometimes there are things that you see in your head that you either can't figure out how to do, or you think you're going to figure out a really great way to do it, and it becomes much more difficult than you anticipated. What I found out the hard way, when it was too late to turn back, is that these heavy embroidered leaves, these are beautiful. I was hanging on to these. I had no idea what I was going to do. I loved them. I didn't want to screw it up. Thought how wonderful they would be incorporated with this heavy piece of embroidery from Mexico. But this created such a heavy surface, I literally could not use the embellisher machine to needle felt the parts together because it wouldn't even fit under the needle felt machine needles. So I was in a tiz about what to do, and I called up a friend of mine, my dear friend Lynn Lukanen, and she said, oh, I've got the stuff so that you can hand felt, and I'll loan it to you. So lo and behold, Lynn shows up, and she's got this block of wood about that big around, probably 3 inches in diameter, with long, sharp, nasty looking needles. And the whole idea of hand needle felting is with a pad underneath to do this whole thing by hand. Well, this series would not have evolved if I had had to do the entire thing with that tool. So I learned two things: to admire and respect greatly anybody who does hand needle felting. I knew how to do it pretty well by the time I got that finished, but also to think about the incorporation of materials before you get to the point of backing yourself into a corner, instead of when you've just backed yourself into a corner. So I never tried to put together heavy layers like that again, because it just wasn't really working for me. But it did work on this piece, which is now one of my favorites. And the gold leaf heart is an element that isn't found anywhere else in the series, but it seemed appropriate as an homage to Frida Kahlo. This piece is probably, if not the most complex piece in the entire exhibition, in the top 3 or 4. It incorporates a lot of very different embroidery pieces. This piece is actually not even finished, which I loved. When I could find pieces like that, I was delighted by them. A lot of the patterning that's happening in this particular framed part of the composition was done with the quilting machine. The frame was laid in with the dye crayons and needle felted wool. I decided to use 2 of these smaller vignettes in the style of Matisse, incorporating small compositions into the larger composition. And of course you recognize a table doily used as a table doily. That's not very inventive, is it? The flowers and the wrens. But the part of this that was very complex was that the tabletop was actually a large piece of fabric that I had waxed and printed and dyed and discharged and waxed and printed, and just happened to have the piece. I put the fusible, the Misty Fuse, on the back and cut it up into individual units so it would look more like tile, and then assembled all of the units and fused them down to create the background of the table, and then used the embroidery and the needle felting machine to outline each of the individual blocks. So that was halfway through. I didn't know whether I was crazy or whether it was a labor of love, but you can't stop then. It's like childbirth, you have to keep going. But I love the way the tabletop turned out, and I like the way all of the parts came together. We have one piece left. This is Matisse's Birdfeeder. And again, I was so fortunate to find this beautiful embroidery, which was a kit. That was probably a Busilla embroidery kit from the late 70s. Cut those parts out. Created the fruit and the bowl and the vase from my own fabrics, adding the texture with the needle felting. The tabletop is a series of doilies that were alike that could be overlapped in order to create the form. This had actually more of a direct influence from Matisse than most of the other pieces, because in the piece that I was inspired by, he had a very similar sort of pattern on the background of the wall on the right. He had a very similar sort of pattern on the background behind the tabletop in his painting. And this is the only time that I literally took an image that was in a frame in the Matisse painting upon which this was based. I copied the image, the face, the profile. I blew it up so that it would be the right scale for the piece. And then I screen printed it into that fabric circle. And so I challenge you to go, plane overhead, I challenge you to go to the internet and look at paintings by Matisse and figure out where that came from. And if you figure it out, let me know. I hope you've enjoyed sharing this with me. I've certainly enjoyed talking about it. It brings it full circle to be able to talk about it with an audience. So have a great day, and thanks for joining me.